Yesterday we learned the Mishnah, which concluded on the very top of DAF Chaf Gimel Amid Aleph, and the Mishnah had told us that if you make a sukkah on a boat, or if you make a sukkah on a wagon, it's kosher, and it's kosher that you could even go in the sukkah on Yantif. There's no problem if you're on a boat, going inside a portion of the boat. You can go from one place on the boat to the other. It's perfectly fine. The chiddush, though, is that even though the boat is well elevated above the ground, it's still a kosher sukkah. Even though the boat is moving, it's a kosher sukkah. And now we're going to see another point that could be potentially problematic about a boat sukkah. Mani masnisan Rabbi Akiva. The Gemara says, according to whom is our Mishnah? It goes according to Rabbi Akiva. The Tanya ha'osa sukkasa barosh asfina. Because the Brisa says that if a person makes a sukkah on top of a boat, Rabbi Gamliel posel v'Rabbi Akiva machshasus, we see up a machlokas tanoim specifically to a boat. And as we'll see, the issue has to do with the wind situation when you're on a boat in the middle of the ocean. Those of you who are seafarers know that it gets quite windy when you're probably even on Lake Ontario. It's probably very windy if you go out far enough, right? So you have an issue of wind, of keeping the sukkah up when you put it on a boat. The Brisa continues and tells us a story about these two Tanoim, Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Akiva. There are a number of stories in Shas when you have these Tanoim on a boat. Amad Rabbi Akiva ve'asa sukkah barosh asfina. Rabbi Akiva gets up and he decides, you know what, sukkah is here, I'm going to make a sukkah on the boat. L'machar nashva ruach va'akrasa. The next day, a wind came and blew off the sukkah, and basically, oy sukkah. So Amar lo Rabbi Gamliel Akiva eichan sukkascha. So Rabbi Gamliel says, almost in a gloating fashion, he says, Akiva, what happened to your sukkah? Where is your sukkah? Meaning, like, I told you so. So Amar Aryai. So Aryai says, let's clarify this. Everyone agrees that any sukkah, no matter where you put it, even if you put it on a boat or you put it on dry land, if the sukkah is so flimsy that it cannot withstand a normal gust of wind that is on dry land, that just would normally blow on a non-hurricane force, just a normal wind. So if the sukkah is so flimsy, it's going to get knocked down from that kind of wind, so then the sukkah is not kosher. If the sukkah is so sturdy that it could endure even non-normal, abnormal winds on dry land, then everyone would agree that the sukkah is kosher. But you have a middle ground between abnormal land winds and normal land winds. And you know what that middle ground is? Ki pligi b'diyachola la'amod beruach mitzuya diyabasha ve'ena yachola la'amod beruach mitzuya diyam. What we're talking about is a sukkah that is sturdy enough to endure land winds, but is not sturdy enough to endure normal sea winds. And that's the way that they have the girsa.
They don't talk about October in Canada.
Yeah, right. But, October in Canada, I guess you do have strong winds, so you'd have to make, what?
But any time out in the water.
Yeah, but out in the water, that's the issue. So Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Akiva argue about normal winds on the ocean. Is that enough? Does the sukkah have to be strong enough to withstand wind on the ocean? Rabbi Gamliel savar sukkah diras keva ba'inin v'kiven dein yachol olamod baruch mitzuya diyam lo klumi. Rabbi Gamliel says that this is not a kosher sukkah. If it cannot endure a normal wind on the sea, then it's not considered to be sturdy enough to be a kosher sukkah. The question that really has to be analyzed, and I don't have an answer for this, but it requires more analysis, is Rabbi Gamliel only saying that that's not kosher when it's in the sea? Or is he saying that regardless of whether it's in the sea or on dry land, it has to be able to endure sea intensity winds, right? Sea winds. It sounds like from the Gemara, the whole cadence of the Gemara, is that Rabbi Gamliel really only has a problem when it's on the boat, but that's what it would seem. But I'm not 100% sure.
Gamliel doesn't make. He doesn't. I thought there's another issue that Rabbi Gamliel doesn't have a sukkah himself. Maybe he's putter from sukkah when he's on a sfina.
Well, that's what Rabbi Gamliel held. He held that you're putter from a sukkah unless you have the ability to construct something that's so strong that it won't blow. It won't blow away.
Make a sukkah on this boat.
He didn't bother making it because he didn't feel that there was anything that he had available to him at the time, apparently, to be able to keep this sukkah standing.
But the issue is on the. I mean, a lot of the issue could be just on the stock, because you could build very sturdy walls, but you're still stuck.
Correct.
Going on.
The criterion is going to be the schach. You're absolutely right.
There's a presumption when you go on the water that they expect the worst. All sailors do that.
Yes, absolutely. Rabbi Akiva sover sukkah diras arai ba'inun v'keben di chololamod beruach mitzuya di abosha kishera. Rabbi Akiva says no, it doesn't have to be that sturdy because he only requires a diras arai. Just a temporary dwelling is sufficient. We've seen this machlokas consistently throughout sukkah, the first parak. We saw that there are some tanoim that require a sturdier sukkah, some tanoim don't require as sturdy of a sukkah. Rabbi Akiva is of the latter category, and therefore he says, put up the sukkah on the boat. If it blows off, fine, you don't have a sukkah anymore. But until that time comes, it's perfectly fine, since it's at least sturdy enough to endure a land wind. Okay, let us go weiter. O al gabi gamal chule. We learned that if you make a sukkah on a camel or on a tree, it's a kosher sukkah, but there's a secondary problem. You're not allowed to go into that sukkah on Yontif. You can only use it on Chol HaMoed. And the reason is because you're not allowed to mount an animal, ride an animal, climb a tree, or even utilize the weight of a tree to help support you or support anything you need, right? You're not allowed to do that on Shabbos or Yontif. So the Gemara now says, Masnis and Mani Rebbe Meir he, that our Mishnah is also, this halach is also a machlokas, and it goes only according to Rebbe Meir. The Tanya ha'osa sukaso al gabe behema, Rebbe Meir machshir, and Rebbe Yehuda posa. If you make a sukkah on an animal, Rebbe Meir says it's kosher, Rebbe Yehuda says it's pasul. So my time of the Rebbe Yehuda, what's his reasoning? Amar kra chag hasukos ta'aseh lecha shivas yomim. Sukkah haruya l'shiva shema sukkah, sukkah she'en haruya l'shiva lo shema sukkah. Rabbi Yehuda is a very interesting shita. The Torah says make a sukkah for yourself for 7 days, which means that a sukkah has to be usable for all 7 days. Now this has very practical applications la halacha in the Shulchan Aruch. For example, if you put on schach on the first day, right before the first day of Sukkot, but the schach is a certain kind of foliage that by the 7th day it'll all be shriveled and it won't be good schach anymore. So even on the first day it's pasul. It's a very interesting halacha that it has to be able to endure for all 7 days. Rabbi Yehuda takes that quite literally. He says if you have a sukkah that for whatever reason cannot be used for all 7 days, then it's not kosher on any day. And therefore he says, once the Chachamim made a takana that you can't go on an animal on Yontif, then you can't use this sukkah for all 7 days, and ergo it's not a kosher sukkah on any day. And v'Rebbe Meir hanami midiaraisa mechsa chazia v'Rabbanan hu degazruba. And Rabbi Meir looks at it differently. He says, look, I agree with you, you can't use the sukkah on Yontif, but that's only a rabbinic law. But midiaraisa, the sukkah is usable. And since midiaraisa, the sukkah is usable, it's not in violation of the clause that it has to be usable for all 7 days, because that's a biblical requirement, not a rabbinic requirement. So therefore Rabbi Meir says it's perfectly fine, you just can't use it on Yontif, just use it on Chol HaMoed. Okay? So now we go to a related case. We're now going on to another issue, not making a sukkah on an animal, but making the animal as part of your sukkah, which is a little bit bizarre. So I just make sure PETA doesn't get a hold of this video today. So asa lebehema dofen l'sukkah. What if you make an animal one of the walls of your sukkah? Meaning you bring your cow, and it's a very tame cow, and you put the cow up by the wall because you don't have an extra board of wood, and you say, Bessie, stay,
7 days.
and you keep right. Well, you put its trough there, you give it all it needs. and you tell it to stay there. So is that a kosher or a wall for a sukkah? So Rabbi Meir posel Rabbi Yehuda machshir. Rabbi Meir says that it's posel, and Rabbi Yehuda says it's kosher. Here it's a flip-flop. Whereas before Rabbi Meir said a sukkah on an animal is kosher, Rabbi Yehuda says it's posel. Here, when the animal is making the wall, is comprising the wall, Rabbi Meir says it's posel, and Rabbi Yehuda says it's kosher. Shahaya Rabbi Meir Omer kol davar sheyish bo ruach chayim, because Rabbi Meir's shita was any object that is animated, that has a spirit within it, that's alive, ein osin oso lo dofen l'sukkah v'lo lechi l'mavoy v'lo pasin l'biros v'lo gola l'kever. That you cannot use it for any of these structures. You cannot use an animal for a wall, for a sukkah. You cannot use it for a lechi. You can't take like a snake and scotch tape it to the side of your mavoi entrance and say that's my lechi. That's not going to work. Or a really long worm. That's not going to work. Right?
How about a fourth wall?
Fourth wall, you don't need it.
You don't need a fourth
I
wall.
understand, but can you use it?
Velo pasin lebiros, right? You can't pasin lebiros. Remember, passe biros are the L-shaped posts that you have for the well, right? So you can't take your to make it into Rosh Hashanah. So you can't take your cow or two cows and set them up as in the shape of an L to make the passe biros. Velo golo lekever, nor. And this is a kula now, this last thing, Gola Lekever, which we'll analyze tomorrow, Mir Hashem, which is the idea that if you put an animal and make it as a cover for a grave, normally a grave cover, a crypt cover, has the din of the corpse itself, so that it transmits a very high level of tumah. But an animal that's alive, that is covering a crypt, does not constitute that very high level of tumah. We'll talk about that later. And Mishum Rabbi Yossi Haglili Amru Af in Kosfin Olav Gite Nashim. You can't write a get on an animal and present it. Then that's just creative. You take your dog's little poodle Fifi, which is probably the cause of the breakup of the marriage in the first place, and you decide, you know what, honey, you love this dog so much, Raizel Gitech, and you write it on ink on the side of the dog, little Fifi, and you present it to her. So Rabbi Yossi Haglili says that that's not a kosher a get. Find some other creative way to do it. So my time of the Rabbi Meir. So now the Gemara's question is, what's Rabbi Meir's reasoning for saying that an animal cannot be used for a wall of a sukkah, for these other things as well? So Abaya Amar Shema Tamus and Reb Zeir Amar Shema Tivrach. So Abaya says it's a difference of opinion. Abaya's concern is we're worried the animal will die, and if the animal dies, the wall collapses and you have no more wall. And Reb Zeir says something that's much more common, we would imagine, is that maybe the animal will walk away. Right? So now let's understand really what is the machlokas Abaye and Rabbi Zeir. The pil kashur kol alma lo pligi the inami mayis yesh benevela so yud. So he says, let's say you have an elephant that you tie up to a post to make sure that it can't leave. So there, everyone would agree that there's no problem. Both Abaye and Reb Zeir would agree that this would be okay, even according to Reb Meir. Why? Because number one, the animal's not going to run away because it's tied up. Number two, let's say it dies. Even if it dies, it is such a massive animal that it'll still be a wall. Even if it collapses, you'll still have 10 tfachim of height to constitute what?
Plus tips.
Even if it tips, you'll still have, even if it's on its side, you'll still have 10 tfachim height to make a kosher wall.
The smell, it's going to be a smell.
Wears a nice fragrance, this elephant. It's babar, so therefore it's a nice elephant, a very cultivated, groomed elephant. Okay, ki pligi bepil she'eno kosher. So the machlokas is, we're talking about an elephant that is not tied up. So Laman do Amar Shema Tamus lo Chashinan, Laman do Amar Gzera Shema Tivra Chashinan. So the only issue between Abaye and Reb Zeir will be as an example if you have an elephant that's not tied up. So according to Abaye, he's not concerned because even if it dies, you'll still have a massive height of wall. And Reb Zeir, though, is concerned because the animal could always walk away. So Laman do Amar Gzera Shema Tamus Necho Shema Tivrach. So the Gemara says, I don't understand Abaye. You're so concerned the animal might die. Why aren't you worried that the animal's going to walk away? Surely you should be concerned about that's a much higher probability than an animal dying. So the Gemara says, you're right. Ela bepil she'eno kosher kol alma lo pligi. You're right, says the Gemara. Abaye is also concerned that the animal may run away. He has two concerns. It may walk away and it may die. So therefore, when you're dealing with an unchained elephant, everyone agrees that that's going to be a problem. Ki pligi bebehema kishura. The machlokus is, what if you have a regular animal like a sheep or a cow that's tied up? Lamanda Amar Gzeira Shema Tamus Chayshin. And so according to Abaye, we are concerned because the animal may die, it'll crumple, and therefore you're not left with a wall anymore. But Lamanda Amar Gzeira Shema Tivrach Lo Chayshin. But according to Reb Zera, who's not worried about death, he's only worried about the animal running away. Since it's tied up, according to, says Reb Zera, that it still will be kosher according to Reb Meir. Why is Reb Zera only worried about it running away and not worried about it dying? Misa lo shchicha. So the Gemara says because death is uncommon. It's not, even when you tie up an animal, you don't have to worry, unless you abuse it in some way, but we're assuming that's not the case. So we don't have to worry that it's going to die in the middle of Yontif. Okay. So now the Gemara says, I have another question. There's a technical question. V'ha'ika ravacha de beini beini. What about the fact that underneath the animal's legs you have a space? And we'll learn later on that if you have a wall of a sukkah that doesn't go down to the ground, then you have a serious problem. It's not a kosher wall. What about the space that's under the animal's belly? Right? How are you going to mitigate that? So the Gemara says, "Da'avid lei behutza v'dafna." So you have to say that we're talking about a case where you get a bunch of foliage, a bunch of leaves or branches, tie it to the animal's legs, so that the animal will walk around with this foliage attached to its legs to obstruct the space underneath its belly. So the Gemara now says, "V'dilma rava." So now the Gemara says, but wait a minute, even if you chain the animal to where it's there, okay? You put foliage around its legs. But what if it crouches down? If it crouches down, you're dealing with a cow or a sheep. You now have less than 10 tfachim height. How do you stop that? The Gemara says, "Demisicha ba'ashli mila'el." So what do they call those? Was it Kobe bulls? Kobe beef?
Yeah.
The Japanese beef? So how do they get the beef of the Japanese Kobe beef so tender? They take these harnesses and they keep the animals elevated above the ground. That's true Tsar Bali Chaim. They elevate the animals above the ground for their entire life, so they never toughen the muscle tissue. And that's how the meat is so tender. That's the way they cultivate these animals. The Gemara is saying, put a harness underneath this sheep or underneath this cow, lift it up off the ground, just elevate it so that it doesn't have a chance to crouch down. So you'll prevent it from crouching. So it's harnessed.
Can't say good achas.
Right, and that's a good question. No, you wouldn't say good achas over here. We'll have to understand why we don't say good achas.
How do you keep the animal elevated like that? I mean, suspended from something?
Yeah, it's on there's a pulley.
I know in Japan.
He's got a pulley. He doesn't have a piece of
You have one of those big cranes for the high-rise buildings. It's all the way up there, and then you've got it hoisted.
You get the board.
What are you really trying to accomplish here? Like, what's the Indian? Like, this is so...
The animal.
I'm trying to figure out what that is. What is it that we're learning?
We're learning about all different permutations of how it's possible to use an animal as a wall for a sukkah.
Or absolutely not to use an animal for a wall.
Now, there may be an issue of Tzar Bali Chaim that the Gemara is not addressing here. But the bottom line is the Gemara is having, in all likelihood, a theoretical discussion because it's very impractical to do it this way. But it's still possible, and therefore the Gemara wants to examine the different possibilities. So it would turn out that you could make this animal into a wall, provided that you attach foliage to its legs and you hoist it in some ways to prevent it from crouching. So the Gemara now says, well, if that's the case, but if that's the case, that you've hoisted it in some way so that it can't crouch, then why are you worried that it's going to die? Even a Abaye should say that that's a perfectly good wall, because even if it dies, it'll still be hoisted, and it's not going to collapse. It'll just be dead in the hoist. So the Gemara says, Zimnin demokim bepachos mishlosha samach l'skach, v'keven demaisa kavotza v'lava daite. So the Gemara says like this, because sometimes there may be a situation where your animal is just a little bit above the 7 tfachim mark. In order for a sukkah wall to be kosher, in a minimum height where the schach is at 10 tfachim, this wall has to go up 7 tfachim and a little bit more, and then we say lavud between the space of the wall and the space of the schach. Right? Now, in this situation, where the animal is just above 7 tfachim, if it dies, even if it's in its hoist, an animal always, when it dies, shrinks a little bit. because it's no longer breathing, etc. There's no longer any air circulating through it. It'll shrink just so ever so slightly. You won't be aware of it, and that'll passel your wall unbeknownst to you. So therefore, Abaye says that if we're concerned about the animal dying, and that's the reason why it's not a kosher wall, that even if you attach foliage and you put it on a hoist, you still can't use the animal as a wall. Yes?
Are we worried about the animal defecating and making the sukkah puzzle from...
Like I said, it's a very cultivated... Babard is not going to defecate in
rather weak.
You'll take it when he needs to go. You'll take him to the bathroom, and then he'll come back. Right, and you'll train him to flush and everything. It'll be great. Okay, so the Gemara now says, Umi Amar Rabbi Meir Chayish Lamisa Rabbi Yehuda Lo Chayish. So the Gemara is going to say, so you're telling me now, you Abaye, you're telling me that according to Rabbi Meir, you're worried about this remote possibility of an animal dying, which is why you say that the wall's not kosher, and Rabbi Yehuda's not worried about those remote contingencies. V'hatnan, let's look at a Mishnah. It says, Bas Yisrael Sheniseis L'Kohen, V'holach Baila L'Medina Sayam. A Jewish woman, she's a Yisraelis, she's a Bas Yisrael, right? She's married to a Kohen. We know the halacha. When a non-Kohen girl is married to a Kohen, she gets to eat his truma by virtue of her marriage to him. Let's say he goes on a long-distance trip. Is she allowed to eat truma at home while he's away? The answer is Ocheles Betruma Bechezka Shu Kayim. Of course she can. You don't have to be concerned that the guy died. You assume that every day that you don't see him, he's still alive wherever he is on his trip, even though he doesn't call every day. There's no phones, right? So V'Raminan Allah. But now let's raise a contradiction. Hareze Gitech Sha'echas Kaidam Misasi Asur Lechol Betruma Miyad. So if a man is concerned, you know what? He says to his wife, you know what, honey, I'm going away. I want to make sure that if I die, because I'm going on this dangerous trip, that you're not going to fall to Yibum to my brother. Okay, I don't want you to have to go through the whole chalitza process. It's a pain, it's a hassle. So therefore, I'm giving you a conditional get. And the condition is this, that 1 moment before I die, or 1 hour before I die, or 1 second before I die, doesn't matter, this get will take effect. Okay? So therefore, if I come back and I'm alive and everything's great, so we'll tear up the get. But for now, you should know that this get is conditional, that 1 moment before I die, it's a get, so you'll be divorced at the moment of my death, and therefore you won't fall for Yibum or Chalitza. Great. There's only one problem. If a Kohen does this, then his wife has to immediately cease eating any of his truma, even before he leaves on his trip. Because maybe in 5 seconds from now, he'll drop dead. Right, so here you don't say the chazaka that a guy's going to remain alive. Here you say that you have to worry any second he's going to drop dead. So how do you resolve the contradiction? In the previous price, so we can assume that he's going to remain alive so she can eat truma even though he's going to wait for 6 months. But over here, you have to worry that in 5 seconds from now he's going to drop dead even if he's right in front of us. She has to stop eating truma. So why is that? V'amar Abaye lo kasha hareb meir de lo chayish lemisa, hareb Yehuda de chayish lemisa. So Abaye had explained, and this is the same Abaye who says by Sukkah that Reb Meir is worried about death. Here Abaye says Reb Meir is not worried about death, and that's why he says in the first brisa that it's okay for her to eat truma when her husband is away. And who worries about death? That's Rabbi Yehuda worries about death. And it's mamish lahefich over here. So that's our question. We're going to have to answer the question. But where do we see that Reb Meir worries about remote possibilities or contingencies and Reb Yehuda does not? Tanya, the Brisa says as follows. We've seen this multiple times already. Halokeach yain mi bein hakusim. Right before Shabbos, you purchase a barrel of wine from a kusi who does not do any tithing whatsoever. Omen. And Shabbos lichbenching is in literally 30 seconds. You have no kalim with which to tithe this wine, but you want to drink it on Shabbos. So what are you supposed to do? So you do as follows. Omer shnei lugin shani asid lahafrish harehin truma. You look at that barrel, you say, there's 100 logs, let's say, in this barrel. 2 out of those 100 will automatically be truma. Asara meiser rishon, 10 of the logs will be meiser rishon. Tisha Meiser Sheni, 9 will be the secondary Meiser Sheni. Umechal, and then you take, you say the Meiser Sheni will will be transferred its kedusha on coins that I have in my house. You make a mental note of that. Vishosa miyad divrei Reb Meir. Reb Meir says, go ahead and drink the wine right away. And we know Rabbi Meir holds of the principle of breira. So let's say you drink 60 logs of that 100-log barrel over Shabbos, so you have now 40 logs left. We say breira, that retroactively we can say that whatever you designated before Shabbos as Truma and Meiser is part of the remaining 40 logs. Okay, and therefore you'll spill out into vessels the tithes, the truma, and the meiser, and you'll give it to whoever you have to give it to, and then shalom al Yisrael, everything will be great. So Rabbi Meir says that's perfectly fine. You don't have to worry about anything happening to the wine over Shabbos. But Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Shimon Osrin, they say no. They say we have to be concerned. What if something happens to the barrel? What if the barrel bursts? What if the wine gets lost? And then it'll turn out that you'll have drunk tevel because the tithe was never properly taken. So they say you can't do that until you actually physically separate the tithes from the wine. So what do you see from this case? You see that Rabbi Meir is not worried about remote contingencies like a barrel bursting, and Rabbi Yehuda is. If Rabbi Meir is not concerned about a barrel bursting, why is he concerned about death? So the Gemara's question is, you see, we have a contradiction. By Sukkah, Rabbi Meir is not worried about the animal dying, so therefore he says that the wall is kosher. I'm sorry, just the opposite. When it comes to the Sukkah, Rabbi Meir is worried about the animal dying. When it comes to the case of Truma, Rabbi Meir is not worried about the Kohen dying. So which one is it? And you see the same thing by wine. He's not worried about remote contingencies. So the Gemara says, Epoch. Rav Meir chayish lemisa, Rav Yehuda lo chayish lemisa. So to explain the case of Truma, you have to explain it like this. Rabbi Meir is the author of the Brisa who says that she has to stop eating Truma immediately once he gives her the conditional get, because we have to worry that in 5 seconds the Kohen's going to die and she's now currently divorced from him. That's Rabbi Meir, because Rabbi Meir does worry about death just like he worries about it by Sukkah. Rabbi Yehuda is the one who says that she can always assume that her husband is alive and is going to remain alive, and that's why she's allowed to eat Truma when he's away. Tanya, and that's perfectly consistent with the laws of Sukkah. Behema dofen l'sukkah, Rabbi Meir posel v'Rabbi Yehuda machshir. That if you make a wall out of an animal, Rabbi Meir says that the animal wall is puzzle because the animal may die and the wall will become puzzle. And Rabbi Yehuda says we're not worried about that, it's kosher. That's Abaye now is consistent. Rabbi Meir worries about death, Rabbi Yehuda doesn't worry about death. There's only one thing we still haven't resolved. What are we going to do about the case of the wine? The case of the wine, it sounds like Rabbi Meir is less worried about small risks than Rabbi Yehuda is. If Reb Meir is not worried about the barrel bursting, why is he so worried about death? So kasha de Reb Meir ad Reb Meir. So Amar Lecha Reb Meir misa shchicha b'kiyas anod lo shchicha. So the Gemara says Reb Meir he's a good actuary. Rabbi Meir, he's worried to a certain extent about remote possibilities. He's worried about death. Death is something that does happen, and a barrel bursting though is something that you can protect from. Why? Because efshir demasar leila shomer. Because you could always have someone watch the barrel carefully the whole Shabbos to make sure that it doesn't burst. That it should spontaneously burst, Rav Meir says that's completely unheard of. And therefore I'm not worried about that. Just keep someone in charge of it. Death belongs to the reaper. That's the Malach HaMavis's purview. No matter how well you try to watch an animal or a person, when it's their time, it's their time. And that's why Reb Meir says you got to worry more about death than you have to worry about a barrel bursting. So that's why when it comes to Sukkah, when it comes to a Bas Yisrael eating Truma, you have to worry that maybe there's death, maybe the animal will die, maybe the Kohen will die. But when it comes to the barrel, you don't have to worry. You don't have to worry that it's going to burst on its own. But the Gemara says, okay, fine, you've explained the contradiction in Rabbi Meir, but Kasha, the Rabbi Yehuda, what about Rabbi Yehuda? Rabbi Yehuda's never worried about remote chances when it comes to death. If he's not worried about an animal dying, if he's not worried about the Kohen dying, then surely he shouldn't have to worry about the barrel bursting. That's an even more remote possibility. So why is he worried about the barrel bursting, and which is why he says you can't do this, you can't do this shtick before Shabbos to enable you to drink the wine? The Gemara answers, "Time of the Reb Yehuda lav mishum dechayish lebekiyas anod, ela mishum delesle breira." The Gemara answers very simple. Rabbi Yehuda's concern is not that the barrel's going to burst. Rabbi Yehuda's concern is that you don't say breira. Breira is this retroactive halachic phenomenon that we saw consistently in many masechtos throughout Shas, that there's a machlokas between Reb Meir and Reb Yehuda whether we even apply the principle of Breira. What does Breira say? I'm making a declaration now, and certain facts on the ground will change, and retroactively, based upon my determination now, the change status will retroactively be affected based on what I do now. So Rabbi Yehuda says you can't do that. You can't say, well, whatever's left in the barrel after Shabbos will retroactively have been what I designated as Truma and Meiser. You know, you have to actually designate which of those logs are going to be Truma, which one of those are going to be Meiser, and you can't say, well, whatever's left will be retroactively that. It doesn't work that way. We don't say Breira. Rabbi Yehuda doesn't hold that that principle even works. Right? You have to, if you want Meiser to be Meiser, it's got to be, you got to know which one is Meiser right now. You can't say, well, I'll decide later which one is Meiser. It doesn't work that way. So the Gemara now says, and that's why Rabbi Yehuda says you can't do this. Not because you're worried the barrel's going to break, but because there's no retroactivity according to Rabbi Yehuda. What do you mean he doesn't worry about the barrel bursting? Look at the brisa. Look at what the argument. These three rabbis who argued with Rabbi Meir said, Rabbi Meir, look what's going to happen if the barrel bursts over Shabbos. It'll turn out that you'll have drunk Tavel because you never tithe properly. So you very clearly see that they hold that the concern is the barrel bursting. And what was Rabbi Meir's response? So Rabbi Meir says, we'll worry about it when the barrel bursts, meaning that I'm not worried that the barrel's going to burst. Right? So Michlal dechayish Rabbi Yehuda l'kiyas. So you see Rabbi Yehuda clearly is worried about the barrel bursting. So the Gemara answers, Hasam Rabbi Yehuda hu dekarmala Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda is only addressing Rabbi Meir's shita, and he's saying like this, Lididi Leslie Breira. Rabbi Yehuda is saying, look, the reason why I hold you can't do this is forget about the risks of a barrel bursting. That's not my concern. My concern is halachically you don't even get off from step one, because there's no such thing as Breira, in my opinion. You can't say I'll decide later which is the designated Truma and Meiser. It doesn't work. But L'didach the Yesh Breira. But according to you, Reb Meir, who holds that there's such a concept as retroactivity, but you should have a concern. You, Rabbi Meir, who's so concerned about remote contingencies like death, you should also worry about the barrel bursting. And on that, and that's where Reb Meir says, okay, thank you for being concerned about my sheet of Breira. But I'll tell you something, I'm not worried about the barrel bursting either. I do worry about death, but I'm not worried about barrels bursting. We'll hold it here for today.